Stop everything, because what just happened might have just flipped this entire situation upside down. And I'm not even exaggerating right now. What if I told you that Tiny Harris just dropped a message so unexpected, so calculated, that it might have just shifted the entire balance in the ongoing war between T.I. and 50 Cent? Yeah, I said it. Shifted the balance. But here's the real question nobody is asking, was this message really about peace? Or was it a warning disguised as calm? And why, out of nowhere, is Lil Boosie suddenly stepping into the picture like he knows something the rest of us don't? Because, let's be real for a second, Boosie doesn't just jump into situations unless there's something deeper going on behind the scenes. So now the internet is buzzing, fans are divided, and insiders are allegedly whispering that this is no longer just a rap beef. This is turning into something way bigger, something strategic, something personal. And if what's being hinted at is even halfway true, then what we're about to break down today might just change how you see this entire situation forever. So the real question is, are we looking at damage control or the beginning of an even bigger explosion? Stay right there. The moment that message from Tiny Harris hit the internet, everything shifted. And I mean everything. At first glance, it looked calm, almost too calm, like someone trying to pour water on a fire that had already burned half the house down. But if you really listened to what she was saying, and more importantly, what she wasn't saying, you start to realize this wasn't just a simple, I'm unbothered moment. This felt calculated. This felt strategic. Because up until now, the entire situation between T.I. and 50 Cent had been escalating in a way that was getting messier by the day. You had social media jabs, old tensions resurfacing, family members stepping in. And at one point, it honestly felt like we were watching a slow-motion explosion that nobody was even trying to stop. And then suddenly Tiny comes out, almost dismissing everything, saying she wasn't even that affected, saying her family was more upset than she was. And that right there is where things started to get interesting, because when someone at the center of a storm acts like it's just a light breeze, you have to ask yourself why. Now let's not forget, this isn't Tiny's first time being dragged into something messy. She's been in the industry long enough to understand how narratives work, how stories get twisted, and how one post can turn into a full-blown media circus overnight. So when she downplays the situation, it doesn't come off as ignorance, it comes off as control. Like she's trying to redirect the energy, trying to change the conversation before it spirals into something even bigger. But here's the thing. While she's out here acting like it's nothing, the rest of the players involved are not treating it like nothing at all. And that's where the tension starts to build, because now you've got two completely different energies colliding. On one side, you've got 50 Cent, who has built an entire reputation off not letting anything slide. And on the other side, you've got T.I., who clearly feels like certain lines have already been crossed. And if we're being honest, this whole situation didn't just appear out of nowhere. There's history here. There's ego here. There's years of underlying tension that people might have forgotten about, but clearly never disappeared. You don't just wake up one day and start throwing shots at someone like 50 Cent, unless there's something deeper fueling it. And the same goes the other way around. 50 doesn't just pick random targets without a reason, even if that reason is wrapped in humor or sarcasm. So when Tiny becomes part of the conversation, whether she wants to be or not, it changes the dynamic completely, because now it's not just about two artists going back and forth. Now it's about family, respect, and boundaries. And that's exactly why her message hit differently, because instead of escalating things, she almost neutralized them on the surface. But underneath, it feels like something else is brewing. Because think about it, if she truly didn't care, why address it at all? Why even acknowledge the situation if it was really that insignificant? That's the part that has people talking, because sometimes saying less actually says more. And while the public is sitting here trying to decode her tone, trying to figure out if she's genuinely unbothered or just playing it smart, something else quietly started happening behind the scenes that most people didn't catch at first. Enter Lil Boosie. And now things start to take a completely different turn. Because Boosie isn't just another voice in the crowd. He's known for speaking his mind, for jumping into situations with zero filter, and for saying things that most people wouldn't dare to say out loud. So when his name starts getting tied into this situation, people immediately start asking questions. Why now? Why this situation? And more importantly, what does he know that the rest of us don't? Because, let's be real, Boosie doesn't move randomly. When he steps in, there's usually a reason. Whether that reason is personal, strategic, or something else entirely. And according to what's been circulating, there are whispers that Boosie has been in contact with people close to both sides. That he's been hearing things that haven't made it to the public yet. And that his involvement might not just be about defending anyone, but about exposing something bigger. Now, whether that's true or just speculation, one thing is clear. His presence adds a whole new layer to this situation. Because now it's not just about what's being said publicly, it's about what might be happening behind closed doors. And that's where things start to feel less like a typical rap beef and more like a chess game. where every move is being calculated. Meanwhile, 50 Cent has been unusually quiet compared to his usual standards, and that alone is raising eyebrows. Because if there's one thing people know about him, it's that he doesn't stay silent when his name is being mentioned. Especially not in a situation like this. So the fact that he hasn't responded in the way people expected is making some believe that he's waiting, watching, and possibly preparing something bigger. Because when someone who thrives on confrontation suddenly steps back, it's rarely because they're backing down. More often than not, it's because they're planning their next move. And then you've got T.I., who seems to be standing firm, not backing off, not retreating, but also not fully escalating in a way that would completely blow things out of proportion. It's like both sides are holding back just enough to keep things from going completely off the rails, but not enough to actually end the situation. And that creates this tension, this feeling that something bigger is coming, something that hasn't been revealed yet. Because right now, everything feels like the calm before the storm, like the moment right before everything either settles down or completely explodes. What makes this even more interesting is how quickly the narrative is shifting. One moment, it's about a post. The next moment, it's about respect. Then suddenly, it's about family. And now it's starting to feel like it could turn into something much larger than any of those individual pieces. And Tiny's message, whether intentional or not, has become the center of that shift. Because by stepping in and seemingly downplaying everything, she didn't just calm things down, she changed the direction of the conversation. She made people pause, rethink, and question what's really going on. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because while all of this is unfolding, there are other voices in the industry quietly watching, waiting, and possibly choosing sides. And that's something people don't always see right away, because not everyone jumps online and makes their stance clear. Some people move in silence, some people observe, and some people only step in when the timing is right. And if Boosie stepping in is any indication, that timing might be closer than we think. Because once more voices start getting involved, once more perspectives start being shared, this situation could escalate in ways that nobody initially expected. And the biggest question right now isn't even who's right or wrong, it's what's coming next. Because if this was just about a simple disagreement, it would have already faded by now. But the fact that it's still evolving, still pulling in new players, still raising new questions, suggests that there's more to this than what's being shown on the surface. And as long as that's the case, people are going to keep watching, keep speculating, and keep trying to figure out what's really going on behind the scenes. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one message or one moment. It's about the ripple effect that message created. It's about how one statement can shift an entire narrative, how one person stepping in can change the direction of a situation, and how quickly things can go from controlled to unpredictable. And right now, everything about this situation feels unpredictable, like it could go in any direction at any moment. And just when it seems like things might be settling down, new information starts to surface, new voices start to speak, and the entire story takes another turn. And that's exactly where things start to get even more intense, because just when people thought Tiny Harris had cooled everything down, a completely different narrative started bubbling up behind the scenes. And this is where things stop looking like a simple back and forth and start feeling like something much more calculated. Because according to what insiders are allegedly whispering, that message Tiny put out wasn't just her speaking from the heart. It was part of a much bigger play to regain control of a situation that had started slipping out of their hands. Now, whether you believe that or not, you have to admit, the timing is very interesting. Because right before she spoke out, the energy online was getting dangerously close to crossing a line that could have triggered a full-blown escalation between T.I. and 50 Cent. And suddenly everything slows down just enough for people to catch their breath. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Because while the public was focused on Tiny's Tom response, there were alleged leaks starting to circulate about private conversations, behind-the-scenes meetings, and even claims that certain posts and reactions we saw earlier might not have been as spontaneous as they seemed. Some anonymous sources are even claiming that both camps have been monitoring each other way more closely than anyone realized, keeping tabs on moves, reactions, and even fan responses like it's some kind of digital chess match. And if that's true, then what we're watching isn't just drama, it's strategy, it's positioning, it's calculated chaos. Now, let's talk about Lil Boosie stepping into all of this. Because his involvement didn't just add fuel to the fire, it changed the entire temperature of the room. Reports started floating around that Boosie had allegedly reached out to mutual contacts, trying to get clarity on what was really going on, and at the same time, there are claims that he's been privately advising one side to be careful about how far this goes, and that right there raises a serious question. Because when someone like Boosie starts playing both observer and participant, it usually means there's more at stake than what we're seeing publicly. It's almost like he's positioning himself as both a commentator and a potential mediator, but at the same time, people are wondering if he might be preparing to pick a side once things become clearer. And just when you think that's the peak of the confusion, another layer gets added because there are rumors that certain individuals close to 50 Cent have been quietly pushing the narrative that this whole situation was blown out of proportion from the start, suggesting that the initial posts weren't even meant to spark this level of reaction. But here's the problem with that claim. Because if that were true, why hasn't there been a clear effort to shut it down completely? Why allow it to keep simmering, to keep growing, to keep pulling more people into it? That's the part that doesn't add up. And it's exactly why people are starting to believe that there's something else going on beneath the surface. Meanwhile, T.I. appears to be maintaining a very specific kind of silence. Not the kind of silence that suggests retreat, but the kind that suggests observation, like he's watching everything unfold, taking notes, and waiting for the right moment to respond in a way that shifts everything back in his favor. And if you've been paying attention to how these situations usually play out, you already know that silence can be just as loud as any statement, especially when it's coming from someone who isn't known for backing down. It creates tension, it builds anticipation, and it leaves people wondering what's coming next. At the same time, fans have started dissecting every little detail, every post, every comment, every subtle hint that might point to what's really going on. Social media has basically turned into a full-blown investigation board, with people connecting dots that may or may not even be connected. Some are convinced that this is all leading up to something bigger, maybe a public confrontation, maybe a major reveal, or maybe even something that has nothing to do with music at all. Others think it's all just being overanalyzed, that what we're seeing is exactly what it looks like. Nothing more, nothing less. But when you have this many moving pieces, this many voices, and this much history involved, it's hard to believe that it's really that simple. And then there's the financial angle, which is where things start to get even more interesting, because some of these alleged leaks are hinting at business disagreements, old deals, and past collaborations that might not have ended on the best terms. Now, none of that has been confirmed, but if even a fraction of it is true, it would explain why this situation feels so charged, so layered, and so difficult to resolve. Because when money, reputation, and legacy all get mixed into the same equation, things rarely stay simple. They get complicated fast. And once they reach a certain point, it becomes less about resolving the issue and more about protecting your position. And let's not ignore the public reaction, because that's playing a huge role in how this is unfolding. Fans are split, some siding with 50 Cent because of his history of dominating these kinds of situations. Others backing T.I. because they feel like certain lines shouldn't have been crossed in the first place. And then you've got a whole group of people who are just watching it all unfold like it's entertainment. Not even trying to pick a side, just waiting to see what happens next. And in a way, that audience reaction is part of what keeps situations like this alive. Because as long as people are watching, talking, and engaging, the story keeps evolving. But the biggest curveball in all of this is still Tiny's role. Because despite everything that's happening around her, she's managed to remain the calmest voice in the room. And that's not something you can ignore. Whether it's genuine or strategic, it's effective because it forces everyone else to adjust their approach. It puts pressure on the more aggressive voices to either dial it back or risk looking like they're overreacting. And in situations like this, perception matters just as much as reality, if not more. Because once the public starts seeing one side as calm and the other as chaotic, the narrative starts to shift in a way that can be very hard to reverse. And yet, despite all of that, there's still this underlying feeling that we haven't reached the peak of this situation yet. It still feels like we're in the middle of something that hasn't fully revealed itself. Like there's another layer waiting to be uncovered. Another piece of information that could change everything again. Because if there's one thing we've learned from situations like this, it's that they rarely end quietly. They either explode into something bigger, or they take a sudden turn that nobody saw coming. And right now, with Lil Boosie hovering in the background, with both sides holding their positions, and with new rumors continuing to surface, it feels like we're heading toward one of those moments where everything either comes together or completely falls apart. Because the more this unfolds, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just about one post, one comment, or one misunderstanding. It's about everything that led up to this point, everything that's been said and unsaid, and everything that might still be waiting to come out. And just when you think you've got a handle on what's going on, just when it feels like the situation might finally settle into something understandable, another detail emerges. Another voice enters the conversation, and suddenly you're right back where you started, trying to figure out what's real, what's exaggerated, and what's being deliberately hidden. And that's exactly where things start to shift again, because what's coming next doesn't just add to the story, it changes the entire direction of it. And that's exactly where things take a turn that nobody was fully prepared for. Because just as the narrative was starting to settle into this uneasy balance, new whispers began to surface that pushed everything into a completely different territory. Now people aren't just asking who said what or who started it. They're asking what's really at stake here, and why this situation feels like it's building towards something much bigger than a simple clash between T.I. and 50 Cent. Because when you start hearing talk about potential legal tensions, behind-the-scenes pressure, and even alleged attempts to quietly resolve things before they spiral out of control, you realize this might not just be about pride or reputation anymore. This might be about damage control on a level we don't usually get to see. There are now claims floating around that certain individuals connected to both camps have been making calls, not public statements, not social media posts, but real conversations behind closed doors, trying to gauge how far the situation could go if it keeps escalating, and that alone tells you something important. Because when people start moving in silence like that, it usually means they're trying to prevent something from getting out of hand. But here's the problem, because at the same time, those quiet conversations are allegedly happening. The public side of things is still very much alive, still very much unpredictable, and still very much capable of turning at any moment. And then you've got Lil Boosie, who at this point is no longer just an observer. Because, according to what's being speculated, he might actually be preparing to speak more openly about what he's been hearing. Now, if that happens, if Boosie decides to lay everything out the way he tends to do, that could completely change the direction of this entire situation. Because Boosie isn't known for holding back. And if he feels like there's something the public needs to know, he's going to say it, regardless of how it affects anyone involved. And that possibility alone has people on edge, because it introduces a level of unpredictability that wasn't there before. At the same time, there's growing talk about how this situation could start affecting more than just the individuals directly involved. People are beginning to question whether this could have an impact on business relationships, collaborations, and even future opportunities within the industry. Because let's be honest, when something like this reaches a certain level of visibility, it doesn't stay contained. It starts to ripple outward, touching other areas, influencing decisions, and shaping perceptions in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. And once that starts happening, it becomes a lot harder to control the narrative, no matter how carefully it's being managed. Meanwhile, Tiny Harris continues to hold her position on the surface, unshaken in her tone. But now her message is being viewed in a completely different light. What once seemed like a simple attempt to downplay the situation is now being interpreted by some as a strategic move to stabilize things before they reached a breaking point. And whether that was her intention or not, it's having that effect at least to some degree. Because her calmness is forcing everyone else to reconsider how far they're willing to take this, and that creates a kind of tension that's very different from the loud, explosive kind we're used to seeing. But even with that, the uncertainty hasn't gone anywhere. If anything, it's grown. Because now people are wondering if this calm is temporary, if it's just the eye of the storm before everything picks up again. And that's a very real possibility, especially when you consider how quickly things have been shifting up to this point. One moment it's quiet, the next moment something new drops, and suddenly the entire conversation changes all over again. And that pattern makes it very difficult to believe that this is anywhere near over. Then there's the question of how 50 Cent is going to respond moving forward. Because despite his relative silence, nobody actually believes he's out of the picture. If anything, that silence is making people more curious, more alert, more focused on every little sign that might indicate what he's planning next. Because historically, when he chooses not to respond immediately, it's usually because he's waiting for the right moment to make an impact. And if that moment comes while all of this tension is still in the air, it could reignite everything in a way that's even more intense than before. And on the other side, T.I. remains a central figure in all of this. Not just because of his direct involvement, but because of what he represents in the situation. He's not just defending himself, he's defending his image, his family, and his place within the culture. And that kind of pressure doesn't just disappear overnight. It lingers, it builds, and it influences how every move is made from that point forward. So even if things appear to be calming down, that underlying pressure is still there, still shaping the direction of everything that happens next. What makes this situation even more unpredictable is how quickly public opinion can shift. Right now, you've got people analyzing every angle, debating every detail, and forming opinions based on information that may or may not even be complete. And in that kind of environment, it doesn't take much for the narrative to change again. One new piece of information, one unexpected statement, one unverified claim, and suddenly the entire conversation could swing in a completely different direction. And when that happens, it doesn't just affect how people see the situation, it affects how the people involved respond to it. So now we're at this point where everything feels like it's on the edge. Not fully resolved, not fully escalated, just sitting in this space where anything could happen next. And that's what makes it so compelling, because you can't predict how it's going to end. You can't say for sure who's going to step forward, who's going to step back, or what new information might come to light. All you can do is watch, listen, and try to piece together what's happening as it unfolds. And that brings us to the bigger question that's hanging over all of this. Because at some point, something has to give. Either this situation gets resolved quietly behind the scenes, or it reaches a point where it can't be contained anymore and everything comes out into the open. And if it's the second option, if everything really does come out, then what we've seen so far might just be the beginning, not the peak. Because situations like this don't build this much tension without eventually releasing it in some form. So now the spotlight is on everyone involved, on every move, every word, every decision. Because at this stage, even the smallest action could have a ripple effect that changes everything again. And with Lil Boosie still lingering as a wild card, with Tiny Harris maintaining her calm, and with both T.I. and 50 Cent holding their positions, it feels like we're heading toward a moment that's going to define how this entire situation is remembered. Because in the end, it's not just about what happened, it's about how it played out, who controlled the narrative, who shifted the energy, and who ultimately came out on top when everything settled. And right now, we're still in that in-between phase, where the outcome isn't clear, where the story is still being written, and where every new development has the potential to change everything all over again. So now the question is, after everything we just broke down, what do you really think is going on here? Is Tiny Harris actually trying to calm the situation down? Or did she just make a move that quietly shifted the power in favor of T.I.? And what about 50 Cent? Is he really sitting back? Or is he just waiting for the perfect moment to flip the whole narrative again? And let's not forget Lil Boosie, because if he really decides to speak on what he allegedly knows, this could go from tense to explosive real fast. I need to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me whose side you're on and how you think this is going to end. Because right now it feels like we're only seeing the surface of something much bigger. And if you made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. Because if anything new drops in this situation, you already know we're going to be right here, breaking it down piece by piece,